It's so good to be back here again. I used to leave my bicycle in the hallway back in 1998. I want to recognize Miriam Bakary, who has hosted me every one of those years, and I understand will be retiring. But I don't think she'll be riding off into the sunset, something tells me. And I want to also remind you that we will let America decide what is happening. And so I have been here on every election night. There were two momentous occasions, however. One was election night 2000, when I was standing here and somebody had torn off a sheet of paper and handed to me and said, NBC News is calling the election for Al Gore. He just won Florida. And that changed all my prepared remarks while I was here, and that was one momentous occasion. The other momentous occasion was 4 years later, in 2004, when my cell phone was ringing off the wall when I was getting out of a taxi cab, and people were congratulating me for calling the election on behalf of John Kerry, who, according to the exit polls, had won that election. And then, of course, things changed when I was standing here at this podium. So what I'm about to tell you is that what you're going to hear is for entertainment purposes only. So let's talk about the pre-election. And we know that in terms of the United States Senate, Republicans need a net gain of 6 seats. We know that they have 3 seats already. That would be West Virginia, South Dakota, and Montana. So they need a net gain of 3 more out of the next 9 states that are all battlegrounds. Most of those states, even at this moment, are too close to call. Nonetheless, some of those states are trending in favor of the Republicans. And the ones that look like they're trending as we speak are Iowa. These are currently Democratic states. Iowa, Colorado, and Alaska. I'm going to withhold any judgment on Louisiana because I'm assuming, because that's a state where the winning candidate must get 50% plus 1, that will probably go into a runoff election. Mary Landrieu, of course, is the incumbent who is running. She has been in runoffs before and has entered the runoffs, which are 1 month after the election, has entered those runoffs behind and emerged victorious. So we're not going to suggest anything there. At the same time, there is also currently a Republican seat in Georgia, Saxby Chambliss's seat. That is a very closely contested race between Michelle Nunn, who is the daughter of very popular Georgia icon, and David Perdue, who is a corporate CEO. Late polls have Perdue leading, but still too close to call. Now, so with that said, it looks to me as if, given the late polls, it looks to me that the Republicans may very well, but not certainly, may very well get their 6 seats, and maybe as high as 8 seats. There are, in fact, some Democratic seats that were not even supposed to be in play. That includes New Hampshire as one clear example. And the latest polls in New Hampshire have the incumbent Democrat, Jeanne Shaheen, leading by 1 or behind by 1, meaning that it's just too close to call. So what does this mean? I would say that I'm hesitant to, if the Republicans win a majority, to call this election simply a referendum on President Obama. I think in the Senate races, it clearly is about Obama, all about Obama. And as we see from the early exit polls, he's not popular in the battleground states. In fact, my pre-election poll had his approval rating in those battleground states at 38%. The first wave of exit polls have him at 44%. That's enough to make me wonder if something is going on here. We also know from early voting and from early exit polls that there is a much higher than normal turnout of African American voters in North Carolina, which is a very close race, and a much higher than normal turnout of African American voters in Georgia. That, of course, would bode well for Democrats. That's why I'm very, very hesitant. On the other hand, we also know that there are many gubernatorial races. There's a total of 36 gubernatorial races that are up for re-election, and many of those races are too close to call. Some with Republican incumbents, notably Wisconsin and Florida, some with Democratic incumbents, much of New England and Colorado, and those are just simply too close to call. So it looks to me that the entire picture here may very well be less of a Republican wave and more a statement on incumbents. And is regarding the United States Senate, there are more than the usual number of Democratic incumbents or Democratic open seats in states that have previously voted for Mitt Romney in 2012. So what would be the meaning of this election? All right, on one hand, if the Republicans do in fact regain the Senate, then President Obama was correct 2 weeks ago when he said, my policies are on the ballot in all of those states. He's correct. It would be a judgment about Obama. The Republicans had a clarity in their message, and that message was very simply, we're not Obama. Are you happy with the way things are going? And it would appear, anyway, that the resounding answer was no. What was expected to be the dominant issue or issues, Obamacare as one example, the economy as another example, those were not the dominant issues. The two dominant issues were, number one, national security, that overall sense of insecurity under one umbrella that translated meant the possible victories and gain of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, the fear for some form of terrorism here at home, and the Ebola virus, at least up until the last few days. The second dominant issue was the notion that even though by objective standards the economy appears to be improving, the unemployment rate is down dramatically from the time that the president took office and from the peak of the recession, and that new jobs are being created at a steady, almost but not quite impressive pace, that Americans are not feeling that. Their real wages have actually declined over the last few months, and then there's always deep concern on the part of middle-class Americans that they may be losing ground, losing status. And interestingly, one of the issues that no candidate and no party seemed to address was the issue that many middle-class Americans know, and that is inflation. Again, objective standards is that there's low inflation, but the official statistics in this country that keep record of inflation do not include two items, food and fuel, and which I find very curious. And that, of course, impacts everyone. So Republicans were focused in their message. They, secondly, had better candidates this time around than they did back in 2010. Some of you may recall that there was a witch. Well, she wasn't a witch, but she had to say that she wasn't a witch. That dominated headlines, and that there were some candidates that were just deemed too far out of the mainstream, including some who talked about some horrible issues in terms of regarding women. They had better candidates, younger candidates, candidates with impressive records, and candidates who, though while very conservative in their backgrounds, did not emphasize their conservatism in the campaign, and actually ran as more moderate candidates. And they had the luxury to do that by emphasizing more the unpopularity of Obama than the unpopularity of the GOP. Now, the GOP, the grand old party, the Republicans, also had some disadvantages this time. And one of those disadvantages was that they're not beloved by the American people, nor really by the voters in those states. Now, that's kind of interesting because the Republican brand has been hurt over the last few years, and the demographics of the American people and the American voters have shifted dramatically away from the Republican Party over the last few years. The Republicans were able to salvage their brand a little bit during this campaign, but there is a very important question. If the president was so unpopular in those states, and the Democratic Party was hurt so badly in those states, why weren't the Republicans leading in the polls by 10 points, 8 points, 14 points? Actually, despite the unpopularity of the president and the Democratic Party, in all of the states that I polled, my polling clearly showed that the Republicans and the Republicans in Congress were in many instances even less popular. So, what were the Democratic disadvantages? Well, the first and the obvious is that the president is unpopular. But the second and very interesting disadvantage is that they chose to run away from the president. Now, you may say, well, maybe that's good strategy. And there were some political consultants throughout the last couple of weeks saying that it was, Democratic consultants, that it was wise strategy. The problem is that this election for Democrats was always about getting their larger base of support out to vote. Women, particularly young women, Hispanics, African Americans, and socially liberal members of the creative class. Those are people who work in the knowledge sector. The Democrats did not nurture that base, and frankly, not only in retrospect, but I've been saying this right through, the only two people in the United States that have a capability of bringing out that base were Barack and Michelle Obama. And interestingly, they the Democrats hurt themselves by running away from the president, denying the president, and actually running, I think you would have to say, a disingenuous or even inauthentic campaign. And if there's one thing that appeals to independent and moderate voters, it's authenticity. Now, what could the Democratic message have been? Now, frankly, this is risky. I understand. But the Democratic message could have been the economy is improving. Look at where it was. Look at where it is today. This president and the Democratic Party majority saved the economy from a deep depression. More people are covered by health care than ever before, health insurance. Now, that may not be popular with many in the middle class, but it's popular among the base of the Democratic Party. In short, the Democratic candidates denied themselves of even having any message whatsoever. And for that, the elections were close. And more likely than not in the Democrats' favor. I'm going to leave it at that, okay? And I'm sure there are plenty of questions that you might have. And so please fire away. Yes, one and then two. Mm-hmm.
Hi, Ron Bajents with Kuwait News Agency. What about I know this is an obvious one, but you didn't touch on it, but I'm sure you'll want to, is the particular states in play, and then the notion that this presumed Republican gaining of the Senate is very fleeting, and in 2 years they're going to get blown out.
Okay. I'll quickly go state by state. Do you want that? Is that helpful to everybody? Okay, let me do the short version, okay? So let's start with New Hampshire, which I mentioned was not supposed to be close, but became close. Scott Brown versus Jeanne Shaheen. She made some missteps during the campaign, but you have a situation there. Even though New Hampshire has voted for Obama twice, it had voted for George W. Bush twice. It's a swing state. And the gubernatorial race is a one-point race as well, which is extremely interesting. North Carolina, Kay Hagan running against Tom Tillis. You really have a situation where you have two incumbents running against each other. The incumbent U.S. Senator, who was tarnished to some degree by the lack of popularity of Barack Obama, but also the Speaker of the State House in North Carolina, who many had regarded as incompetent and anti-education. That is a race where she's been leading, but leading by 1, at most 2 percentage points on average. Kentucky, Senator McConnell, who may very well become the majority leader, against Allison Lundergan Grimes, the state's attorney general, who has been a big vote getter. That was very, very close at one time, but actually McConnell has led there for months now. And in many ways, her campaign fell apart, and most notably fell apart when there was 41 seconds of silence when she appeared before a newspaper editorial board refusing to say who she voted for in 2008 and 2012, when the obvious answer was Barack Obama, and that's all she had to say. She voted for Obama, and that would have been expected that she voted for Obama. But Obama has 31% popularity or approval rating in Kentucky. Very interesting campaign in Iowa. Everyone assumed that the heir apparent was Bruce Braley, congressman, liberal, whose stance on issues, he's a policy wonk, stance on issues very similar to the incumbent, leaving office very popular, Tom Harkin. But the policy wonk proved himself to be dislikable and arrogant and essentially insulted farmers. Word to you, if you ever go to Iowa, do not insult farmers. Okay, just try to make these as practical as I possibly can for you. On the other hand, his opponent, who's in her first run for political office, very conservative, and that became the issue the Democrats wanted to talk about, how too conservative she was for Iowa. But the problem is for the Democrats is that she was likable. And she became and billed herself as kind of a down-home girl, and born and raised on a farm. So, interesting contrast. Arkansas, Mark Pryor, his father was governor of the state. Mark Pryor won 6 years ago. He was leading June and July and then lost the lead. It had been a 1-point race up until about 3, maybe 4 weeks ago. And his opponent, Tom Cotton, very conservative, very smart, and has been leading on average about 4 to 5 percentage points. Still close, but if the polls are correct, 4 or 5 points, is enough to suggest a strong possibility of a Republican victory. I had already talked about Louisiana. Colorado, Mark Udall was elected very popular 6 years ago. Even though late polls have his opponent, Gardner, leading on average by 3 or 4 points, the total average is about 2.5 points. That's very close. Let me caution you about Colorado. 4 years ago, Michael Bennet, who's the junior senator, was behind in every poll. He's a Democrat. He was behind in every poll going into the election. Even though overall nationally there was not a high Hispanic turnout, there was a very high Hispanic turnout in Colorado. And over 70% of Hispanics eligible to vote did, and over 80% of those Hispanics voted for the Democrat, Michael Bennet. So we're going to have to watch and see Colorado. Alaska, I had already mentioned Alaska. Dan Sullivan has been leading, not by much, 2.5 points, but there was one poll in the last week that did have it a tie, and the Democrats are still hoping there. But the problem, I think, for Democrats in Alaska is that the core constituency, young voters, Hispanics, African Americans, creative class, are not in sufficient abundance for a large voter turnout drive. And I think that covers them. And of course, I mentioned the 3 states that. Now, you had a question. And then you, and then you, and then you. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, sir. My name is Hai Yang. I'm with China News Service. If we say the Republicans win the Senate and Obama would be face a more divided government, so I think he gonna make some compromise on some issues such as immigration, tax reform, something like that, to protect his own, maybe the only legacy, Obamacare. Do you think they can make a deal with the Republican to protect them, Obamacare?
History suggests no. I mean, his writings suggest that he's a mediator and a compromiser. His demeanor and personality suggest that he is not. There is very bad blood between him and Senator McConnell. They just don't talk to each other, and the president has really no relationship with the speaker. Now, they're all going to need a legacy. So, rationally speaking, Both parties need immigration reform. The Democrats, because of a promise. The Republicans, because they can't dare go into 2016 as pariahs among Hispanic voters who are growing in terms of their percentage of the vote. Trade is another issue that begs for compromise, and interestingly, the president and the Republicans are closer on the issue of trade than the president and Harry Reid and the Democrats were. I think there could very well be some tax reform. This is the sort of thing that goes beyond political science textbooks and gets into personalities. And it, by all appearances, you have two extremely difficult personalities. You have the college professor in the White House, and you have a very, very difficult man who may very well be the Senate Majority Leader. Yes, then you, and then you, and you. Okay, sorry.
Leandra Bernstein, RIA Novosti. I'd like to go back to your point about the economy and how that was a major issue for voters, but didn't really get a lot of attention. And it seems odd because typically in midterm elections you're dealing with domestic issues, yet the agenda was dominated by foreign policy issues. The president is likely to go the foreign policy course. Do you see, could you discuss the economic issues and how they might play out in a newly formed Congress?
Yeah, over the next couple of years, number one, we expect continuing job growth, maybe not the greatest jobs, but continued job growth. There is always the possibility of another crash. I mean, let's look at the stock market, for example, which is a bubble if there ever was a bubble. There's always that possibility, but if things are maintained, and of course, in addition to a stock market crash, you also have global issues, notably Europe, that can have a tremendous impact on our economy. In that sense, then, I do think you're going to have the president push for some sort of modest infrastructure bill, but with that infrastructure bill is going to have to come some form of budget cut and tax cut as well, and now that gets into the personalities, and I don't know. Here's what I do know. Whether it's the economy or any other issue, notably spending issue, the Republicans cannot afford to be a do-nothing Congress because that opens the door to the Democrats, to the Democratic candidate running against a Republican-controlled do-nothing Congress. Very hard to do that when you've got mixed majorities in the House and the Senate. And so there's the incentive for both sides to get together and do something. President for his legacy and for the good of the nation, and the Republicans in order to be competitive in 2016. And I say that to be competitive in 2016 because demographics are against the Republican Party as a national party. Yes, and then him.
Stefan Grobe, Euronews. You just mentioned the Hispanic vote. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more? What are their motivation, the motivations of the Hispanics and of the African Americans to vote or not to vote tonight in 2 years? And second, how far are we with regard to states like Texas and Georgia? When will these states become competitive?
Okay, two good questions because I know the answers to those, okay? I actually know the answers to those. in terms of the Hispanic vote, of course, it has been growing uniformly, dramatically over the last 20 years, will continue to grow nationally. What are the incentives to vote? Well, the incentives are that in the pre-election polls, anyway, we saw the president's popularity in the final analysis, and the Democrats' approval rating substantially higher among Hispanics. A lot of that was defensive. They're very fearful of Republicans. The incentive to vote is, an immigration bill, particularly against a party that they see as not only not welcoming to immigrants, but not very favorable to Hispanics. In addition to that, I mean, their concerns are, well beyond immigration, to the economy and to national security as well. But what's important, I think, to understand is that 40% of Hispanic voters used to self-identify as conservative. That's down dramatically to about 32 to 34%. Some of it is because of younger Hispanics, and some of it also is a rejection of conservatism, which they identify as with one of the dominant issues, which is immigration. So if they vote in large numbers, they'll vote more out of fear, for what happens with a Republican majority. Now, there are burgeoning blue states in this country. You mentioned two of them, Texas and Georgia. Georgia could be, if not tonight, then January 6th, because you have two very competitive Democrats who may or may not win, but the race has been competitive in the U.S. Senate, and then also with Jason Carter, the grandson of President Carter, who's been running a competitive race within 2 percentage points. What we do know is that it looks like African Americans have come out to vote. We do know that there's been a substantial increase in the Latino vote. And we also know that around Atlanta and Augusta and Savannah, that there is this growing, burgeoning creative class. Many, are but not all, but many are northern and Midwestern transplants. And so it looks like demographically it'll happen, and it could happen sooner rather than later. Texas was too soon, but you have the same trends. You're going to have about 45% by 2020, 45% of the population of Texas will be Hispanic, and a growing number of votes. And nothing is more contagious among groups like African Americans and like Hispanics than the sense of victory. They're not going to get that this round. And in fact, there was a flawed candidate, as you know, Wendy Davis, for governor. But Texas is a little bit around the corner. I also put in that category Arizona, as well as burgeoning blue. And this will stun some people, South Carolina, which has many of the same trends, a little bit behind, however, North Carolina. Yes. Mm-hmm. And then you.
Thanks. My name is Andrei Sitov. I'm a Russian reporter from TASS, the Russian news agency. And thank you, sir, for doing this. And thanks to our friends for hosting this. I think with your bike, you probably were ahead of the curve in those years. Now everybody rides bikes. I had a policy question and a polling question, I mean, the policy question, there is a bill in the Senate that can do a lot of harm to U.S.-Russian relations if it passes, the Corker-Menendez bill. And it's basically, I think, institutionalizing sanctions against her. So I guess I'm asking for your opinion as to how likely it is to pass, either in the lame duck session or maybe in the next Congress. And then the polling is a follow-up to your description of the competitive states. If we look at the Eastern Seaboard, what are the harbingers that when you see New Hampshire go to Republicans and say this is it? When do you say when you see the expected unexpected results and you say this is it?
New Hampshire. Yeah, New Hampshire. New Hampshire goes Republican. Then I'll hold out for North Carolina. If North Carolina goes Republican, then put the popcorn away, turn the television off, and it's done. Okay. Now, in terms of the sanctions bill, I don't know, whether it will or not, but it could in this kind of an atmosphere.
Does it depend more on the Senate leadership or on the White House?
It depends, actually, on both, but on the Senate leadership in terms of getting it to the floor and getting it out. That's the sort of thing where, the president is portrayed domestically as indecisive. This is Congress making that statement, and all the factions of the Republican Party, and then also sufficient numbers of Democrats to be decisive. Now, on the flip side, on the other side of that, is the notion that we need Vladimir Putin. We need Russia. Why? Well, for the president's legacy. Let's not talk about global security. Let's just talk about the president's legacy. He needs to deal with Iran. I would argue politically he needs to deal with Iran. He needs some sort of progress on Syria. And, Mr. Putin is the 800-pound gorilla, or the elephant in the room, basically. What's that? Oh, the elephant. Okay. the bear in the room. Okay. All right. Yes, ma'am. Yep. And then behind you next.
Thank you. Manar Ghunaim, Middle East News Agency, Egypt. My question is regarding how do you see the foreign policy if the Republicans dominate the Congress? Do you think regarding the Middle East in particular, is there going to be a conflict between the president and the Congress regarding certain issues, for example, the arming of the Syrian opposition, regarding the boots on the ground in the Middle East? How do you see the conflict, or there will be somehow a compromise between both of them? Thank you.
There will be conflict. That's the short answer. There will be conflict. There are conflict of personalities, conflict of ideologies, conflict of different constituencies. Let me explain that one first. The Republican constituency is older, whiter, more conservative, and more militant. Old and white means they remember an America that was the superpower. They remember the Cold War, us versus them, and we were the good guys. And that's how they see their world. The Democratic constituency is very diverse and younger and younger and younger. The group that we call millennials, those born after 1979, there are 76 million adults already, and they are growing. And this is a group that is not militant, does not have its finger on the trigger, sees a United States that works with allies and works with the United Nations, and is less ready to go to war, and particularly in the Middle East. So with that said, it's more than just Barack Obama and Mitch McConnell, or Barack Obama versus Mitch McConnell, John McCain. It's more about who they represent. It is that group of young voters, many of whom are African American. You know, when we look at the millennials, less than 60% of millennials are white. More than 40% are Hispanic, African American, Asian of some kind, or mixed. This is a far different worldview between these two. And this is where Barack Obama gets his sustenance from, not from old white men. He gets his sustenance from younger voters, not all of whom are under 35, but a good portion of them are. Now, measure that against realities. Here is a president who wanted to go to war with Syria, drew a red line, and then immediately saw David Cameron get his red line handed right back to him. Better not even touch this one. Now, meanwhile, you got, I'm simplifying here, but you have old white men saying, we got to go to war, we've got to go to war, we've got to go to war. And a relatively young, or at least used to be young, non-white man saying, let's push back here. What are we going to be able to do? Does our involvement work? Does it make things any better? Can we, if we go in, can we get out? This is the battle that will dominate foreign policy, not only the next 2 years, but the next 10. And then you in the back.
Bahet Tawil on TV Egypt. Actually, my question is about the young voters. Just before the briefing, NBC News reported that 37% of the voters who voted today are older than 60, and just 12% of the voters are under 30 years old. Why do you think the young voters weren't excited about this election? It seems they weren't excited. Like most of the campaigns, it was targeting actually the old voters, not the young voters. Why do you think so?
Okay. For starters, let me say to you that it was 10% in 2010. If it's 12%, that could make it very interesting in these 1 and 2 point races. Why weren't voters, young voters, turned on? They're disappointed. They're discouraged. They're in debt and see their lives in debt. The economy, they feel, has left them behind. They have not gotten, those who've gone to college may be working, but not working to the measure or degree that they feel that they should be working. They also don't trust most institutions. This is beyond government, but let's focus on government and the parties. Young people in particular are problem solvers, and they have a sense of immediacy. If I see a problem, let's get it resolved. They don't understand slow bureaucracies or political gamesmanship. What they understand is crowdsourcing, crowdfunding, going horizontal to find problems or find solutions to problems, and doing it relatively quickly. In that sense, then, there is very little faith in government at every level, in the political parties, and let's go right down the line. The church, the Boy Scouts, the Rotary clubs, everything that has been so familiar with the world of old white men. I'm oversimplifying a little bit there, but I feel I can talk about them because I've joined the ranks.
Yeah, hi, I'm Lauri Tankler from Estonian Public Broadcasting. I have a pretty specific question. The question.
Thank you for Skype, incidentally.
Oh, you're welcome. Seriously. Yeah. The question is about polling, and a lot of the analysts have said, and it's very normal to expect a lower than average turnout for midterms compared to the presidential elections. But there are also some people, some analysts on these news channels that have said that some of this, non-voting is intentional. That some of these people who are not voting do not want to cast their votes for the opposite party, so they just make a statement by not going into the polls at all. Does your polling show something like that? And if yes or if not, why do you think this may be an issue?
I think, for starters, young people not voting and independents not voting in large numbers is not a new phenomenon. That's very old. In fact, if anything changed that, it was the two presidential elections that elected Senator Obama and then reelected President Obama. That drove the numbers of young people and numbers of independents out to vote in greater numbers. So in many ways, this is kind of settling back to normal. But settling back to normal after a period where two elections where it had reached a peak. Many voters don't quite understand. Like young voters and minority voters don't identify with Congress. They don't see it as a problem solving. Actually, they see it as a problem creating institution. So why bother to vote? But the reasons why people don't vote are they're a myriad. Let me list some of them. For poor people, I'm poor on November 4th. I will be poor on January 2nd. What's the difference? For young voters, it's that sense of mistrust of an institution that's viewed as old school, moribund, more interested in making noise, and particularly in the last few years. And then thirdly, there's no charismatic figure. There's no one person to say, here's the philosophy, here's the person, here's the direction, this is where we're going. It's hard to do that under any circumstances in a congressional year. So what you're left with basically is people making statements. And I think if there's a statement that I would use tomorrow, now I've got to watch for the results to come in, but there's an old Mexican peasant slogan from the Mexican Revolution about 100 years ago. And the graffiti said in Spanish, "Down with whoever's up." Not a partisan statement at all. And thanks for laughing, the three of you who did. How are we doing?
Can I just point out that when I asked you that question at the beginning,
You're from southern Kuwait, right?
Yeah, that's right. You remember that. That's my joke. Thank you for laughing. I asked you to quickly, not state by state, go through 2 years hence, and the fact that the fleetingness of the GOP victory and why that is, if you agree with that.
I'm sorry. Okay. No, I'm glad you're re-asking. I think it is fleeting. The demographics in many of these states do not play in favor of the GOP, in 2 years from now. So this would be more of a statement about now than it is about 2 years into the future. I don't think it's a long-term trend.